This series of 3 videos is intended to introduce you to a risk management system that should help you enjoy flying more and make you a more responsible and reliable pilot. Through a series of physical and mental checklists of sort, we will introduce you to a proven way of thinking and encourage you to develop your own way of enjoying the art of sky sailing, whether it is hang gliding, paragliding, or any other type of aviation activity. What you'll learn here may also impact on other aspects of your life: the way you participate in sports, the way you drive, the way you work, and even the way you interact with people.
You're actually teaching a personal lifestyle, not a sport. So to do that, the learning never stops. And the job of a good instructor is to always be a mentor pilot.
One of the dimensions of our sport is trying to learn how to manage the risk. And we want to manage the risk because we wish to fly as many times and as long as we can.
The risk management system we are going to explore is called the Robertson Charts of Reliability, or the RCRs. It's designed to help you firstly assess all the variables involved in flying, and secondly, to help you decide whether or not you should fly. Each video in the series explains how to analyze one of the 3 areas: the wind, or weather and sight variables, the Windividual, or personal variables, and the wing, or aerodynamics and equipment variables. These videos are not designed to replace your instructor, who is essential to your well-being, nor are they meant to replace your textbook. They are intended to be like lectures, to expand and enhance the theory and practice that books and instructors provide.
If you're like me, when you learned to fly, you just wanted airtime. Nothing more than airtime, as quickly as you could get it. And I realize now that had I developed the discipline, focused on the things that need to be done, I would have got there quicker and I'd have got there safer.
I've been blessed with over 40 years of teaching and flying, and I've exceeded my wildest dreams 1,000 times. We want to pass that lesson of a lifetime of dedication to teaching and flying on to you. In the mid-70s, while teaching hang gliding, I began to notice that the information that I was talking about while waiting around on the hill wasn't being retained by my students. My Canadian Air Force pilot training had given me a good theoretical background, and I came to the conclusion that my students, like other pilots, should have classroom instruction too. The first chart, the wind RCR, was the result. Now I felt my students would be able to make good decisions, good choices about when and where to fly on their own.
We all make mistakes, and some activities we do, mistakes are really not much of a problem because it's pretty minor. It might be embarrassing, a little faux pas, but in hang gliding, some of the mistakes can be really very dangerous, and it can just spoil your day.
In researching accidents, I discovered 88% of light aircraft accidents are attributed to pilot error, knowingly flying in bad weather. The Windividual RCR was created to defuse this accident bomb. The wing charts dealing with equipment were added to complete the package. Over the years, the charts have developed into the art of sky sailing, a risk management manual or notebook. If you ask most experienced pilots how they develop their good judgment, they'll say, from bad experience. Life is too short to make all the mistakes yourself. Learning from the achievements and failures of others offers a huge advantage over the traditional school of hard knocks.
But in learning to fly airplanes, I learned a great respect for methodical and kind of structured learning techniques. I've had a very injury-free flying career. I've been confident and comfortable most every flight, but there are times when I've learned where the edge is.
Obviously, in order to do something as dangerous as flying, you should take advantage of all the things that are out there. You need to follow all the standards, you need to constantly review, you need to do all those things that are evident to you that produce safety. You don't have to do that except if you want to be safe.
Beginners, novice, intermediate pilots all should greatly benefit from this information contained in the charts and the accompanying videos. Even advanced pilots should be reminded once in a while that there's always something that we could miss. Everybody wants to give you advice, your instructor, your friends, your loved ones, and this video. But ultimately, it's your choice to do what you want. It's your responsibility.
I think it's perfectly okay for someone to run around with their hair on fire, and the U.S. law permits people to just jump off a mountain with no preparation whatsoever and fly anything they want, a picnic table. And I think everyone has the right to fritter their life away, foolishly.
There's plenty of stuff on the videos that should make sense to you. And if you can use that information, wonderful. If some topic doesn't mesh with your thoughts and feelings, because you find it complicated, weird, or esoteric, be patient and keep an open mind. You will always be able to review that section later when you feel more comfortable, or simply leave it out. Remember that the more informed you are, the easier and better your decisions will become. We believe that developing your judgment will help you choose the good days to fly and avoid the really bad days.
And I use the RCRs with students and have them fill them out before each flight during their training to ensure that they're looking at the myriad of factors that come into play when you're flying.
We try and establish a basic set of parameters that most of our students can fall into. In teaching them the concept of risk management early on, we find oftentimes they will reduce what they feel comfortable operating in to a smaller area than we've actually defined for them as being okay to fly in.
For me, the chart of reliability was really a big find, because one of the hardest concepts was how to explain to a student the key items to look at. I mean, what should you go through in your mind before actually launching that glider to give you that feeling that you've looked at the different pieces or the different elements that constitute a safe flight.
I should warn you that the first time through the charts, they might seem long and complex. I assure you, like riding a bike, it'll become simple and second nature. Trust me, you'll see.
Well, there's a checklist. It really is about training and going through a list of...
So you memorize that?
I memorize the list, absolutely. It becomes automatic and it becomes rote. And that's helped me stay focused many times.
So let's get started on being the best we can be. In the field of risk management, it's plowing time. Let's plant some seeds for safety. The wind is wondrous for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's invisible. And secondly, it's kind of mystical because even professionals are constantly getting weather wrong. In fact, statistically, the weatherman gets it wrong more than he gets it right. On the other hand, because he's predicting for a huge area for a long period of time, he's probably going to be right somewhere. What we're going to do is try to train you how to analyze the situation where you are and how to monitor change so you can predict your reliability. We'll look at macrometeorology, the big picture, the global view, then micrometeorology, the local weather picture, and finally site selection and analysis. There are really only a couple of things that get air moving globally. Here's the globe. At the top, you've got the North Pole, then in the middle, the equator, and then there are a couple of lines in the middle there. What are they? This one is the Tropic of Cancer, 30 degrees, and at 60 degrees, the Arctic Circle. Now, these are the main lines of latitude. There are also meridians of longitude. You might be interested to know that 0 is Greenwich, England, and that's what weather time is based on. So if you hear Zulu referred to, it means Zulu time is in Greenwich, England. The two things that get things moving globally, now what are they? Well, one, it's the sun. The sun is the big engine that really drives everything, so it's number one. What the sun does is cause differential heating. If everything were the same temperature, you wouldn't really get any kind of action. So if you have two adjacent places with different temperatures, that's what gets things going. Now, if we look at the globe as a whole, we have two vastly different temperatures going from the middle to the top. So what happens at the equator? What happens to warm air? It rises. Now what happens to cold air? It sinks. So we got warm air rising at the equator and we have cold air falling at the pole. Now a fairly accurate approximation of what really happens is the air doesn't go all the way to the pole. It goes about 30 degrees and then sinks. And then, relatively speaking, warming again at the Arctic Circle, it rises. So this gives us what's called the triple cell theory of global air movement. Now, if we think of these as centers of weather systems, they're called highs and lows, right? Warmer, lighter, hence lower pressure. Heavier, cooler, hence higher pressure. Now here at 30 degrees we have the horse latitudes high and then the polar high. And these other two are lows, the equatorial low and the Arctic Circle low. Again, these are going to move around a little bit, but it's amazing how often it happens just like this. Now what's the other thing that's happening to the globe in addition to differential heating? The second engine driving air globally is the rotation of the Earth. The equator goes about 20,000 miles a day. The Arctic Circle might go only about 2,000. So the ground is moving faster at the equator than further north or south. The result of that differential distance is that moving particles tend to move to the right in the northern hemisphere. And this is called Coriolis effect. By the way, moving air in the southern hemisphere would be the opposite, so the flow would be a mirror image. Let's first look at a high. We'll draw it round, but it could be irregular or elongated. Interestingly, the way this performs is similar to how water would flow on a hill. If these, instead of being isobars joining points of equal pressure on a weather map, were lines that joined equal altitude on a topographical map, this would be a volcano. And if we had a spring coming out of the top of the mountain, what would happen? Well, the steeper the slope, the faster the water would flow. Steeper the pressure gradient, the stronger the wind. We'll get back to that. Now the air is tending to flow from high to low. It makes sense, right? It's coming down and then going out and then rising up as it gets relatively warmer. That's the big picture. But if we think about smaller example, like a shoreline with a big body of water, the air is moving in and rising above the land and sinking over the cooler water, which is kind of a mini high. You'll get it over a parking lot. It's the same kind of thing. So you've got small things, mini things, and then you've got bigger things, and then you've got monster things, and they're all really operating on the same basic principles. Understanding the principles really helps us figure out what's going on in our local area. Like the water running downhill, the air is running out from the center of the high and gradually bending to the right more and more. So what have you got? Well, you've got clockwise flow around a high, and secondly, strong winds at the outside and light winds in the center. It's kind of interesting that weather people call an elongated high pressure a ridge of high pressure, or they call an elongated low a trough. If we're going to draw a low, if this is the lowest point on our topographical map, now what have I drawn? It's a crater, right? So how's the water going to run? It's going to run from the top to the bottom. It's got to start at that upper edge. And if it was elongated, it would be a valley. So it's flowing down and then bending to the right. Isn't that interesting? For exactly the same reason we get clockwise flow around a high, around a low, we get counterclockwise flow, and the strong winds are in the center. It's exactly the opposite, a mirror image. Lows have strong winds in the center. As we noted earlier, the other thing that works is if the hill is steeper, the water would flow faster. So guess what? If you have a tight pressure gradient, if the lines, the isobars joining points of equal pressure on a weather map are tight together, you've got a lot of wind. If it's a lazy system and the lines are spread like 200 miles apart, now you're going to have much mellower winds. That's what you're looking for. In a low, where would you want to be? On the outside, where the winds are light. In the center is where the storms are. Now, think about this. If you've got air in a really strong low, coming in, spinning, and going up, what would that be? A really dramatic low would be a twister. It's the ruby slipper thing. So that's kind of a quick and easy overview of the big picture and where weather comes from. It's very interesting how often just this little piece of information can help you visualize the flow and the reliability of the air. It can also help you predict the strength and direction of the wind. Now, how could that be? Well, let's look on the map. Say we're here on a high. As the high comes across, and if we're in the northern hemisphere, it comes from west to east, I can show a line where the high passes over us. Now the high is usually moving fairly slowly, sometimes rapidly, and sometimes it locks in and sits stationary. But if the center of the high is below us, it'll track across here, assuming that the high moves evenly. Now it could slide up or down a little and even come in above us. It can happen, but it's surprising how often it happens just like this. So what would the winds be as this high comes in? Well, we're on the edge, so strong winds. And from what direction? You know, this is one of the few things on the planet that we describe its direction by where it's coming from rather than where it's going to. How often are you in your car and you think, well, I think I'm going to head from the south? No, you say, I'm heading north. With wind, we don't do that. It's probably because we tend to face it, as do horses and birds. Whenever you see a bird perched, it's almost always facing into the wind. Cows like to face downwind. Go figure. I guess that's why they don't have wings. Anyway, right here, when that first edge of the high comes in, it would be a strong northwest flow. How strong would it be? And what would determine how strong it is? How steep is the hill? How tight is the gradient? If the lines are close together, tighter gradient, stronger winds. And then as we get in towards the center of the high, what's going to happen here? Well, a high is beautiful weather. Lows are storms. The center of a high is clear and fair. Again, what's the wind going to be here? Westerly and lighter. So the most reliable spot in the system for us to fly is right here in the center, especially if it's a wide pressure gradient. Of course, highs can be as big as a field or a pond, or as big as half a continent, or anything in between. When people ask, how big is a thermal, or how big is a high? Well, it depends. Generally speaking, tighter the gradient, smaller the system. The lazier the gradient, the larger the system. Kind of makes sense. Now, let's look as the high is leaving. What can we expect the wind to be? Well, we're at the edge of the system, so we're way over here. The wind's coming from the southwest. And how strong? Strong. So, a strong southwest wind is predicting the high is leaving, and quite likely there's a low behind it, and not great weather to follow within a day or so. Just that single thing of watching the highs and lows can really help. Naturally, it depends where you are on the globe. I think if we go to the chart soon, we can put all this together. It's not even that important that you understand this. It's just kind of neat. In fact, one of the coolest side effects of flying is getting on a first-name basis with the weather. You start to watch and understand the weather. Weather will never be the same for you. It will be magical. But because you begin to understand it, it's not as mystical as it once was. Like flying, you will always be getting better and understanding more. Sometimes topography can change things. Mountains and large bodies of water will make their own weather. There are several aero towing setups in the middle of Florida. They benefit from this convection. Air comes from both shorelines, pushing inland, and all that warm air is going to rise at some point. There have been 300-mile flights happening down there. Zapata, Texas is the site of the world record encampment. It's kind of in the middle between the Gulf and the Pacific coast. On those hot summer days, like 100-degree Fahrenheit plus, all that hot air is rising in the cooler ocean and Gulf air, pushing in, and then wow, pilots get to 8,000-foot cloud bases and are able to run with that south wind siphoning up. World records have been set there with flights over 400 miles. As we saw in the introduction, we're learning a system of evaluation. We do this by simply scoring each line on the charts. It's just like a thorough checklist. It's a really easy way to simplify the decision about whether or not to fly. We simply base our decision on a percentage. Do I have 75%? which is what I need as a beginner? Do I have 65% as an intermediate? Or if I'm an advanced pilot, 50% is my minimum. Really, the bottom line is, how safe do you want to be?
It's like this. Here's the safest you can be, and here's the most dangerous you can be. You have to kind of decide, where do you want to be in this picture? And I have to say that where I want to be is, I want to be over here where no man has gone before, and where you are, well, that's up to you. You want to be in the middle, that's okay. You want to be medium safe, all the way to the crazy side, it's up to you.
I became totally amazed at this gentleman because, first of all, he started his first paragliding lessons when he was 80 years old. And he's still flying today. This guy really does do a thorough, organized analysis of conditions. And normally he will only fly when conditions are perfect. But when he does fly, you've never seen anybody with a bigger grin and a bigger smile on his face than this guy has.
This is a chart of reliability. Now, what do we mean by that? Does that mean it's great for flying? What does reliability mean in a person? What do you think? Predictable. You can count on them. It's not soarability or flyability, it's reliability. The essence of reliability is the absence of imminent change. A really good soaring day needs to be a bit unreliable because we've got to have some kind of action in the air to keep us up. If we're on a ridge, we need stronger winds. If we're flying thermals, we need temperature differentials that create vertical shear. That's why, as you get to be more experienced, you actually want less reliable air, in a way. In your risk management manual on page 10, you will find the hill chart. Page 12 shows the tow chart. The factors on the right side of the charts are more reliable, which is what we want. Now on the facing page, that shows you how to actually score the chart. That's the scoring guide. The top half, the weather variables, is the same for both charts. Let's look at these first 10 variables. Weather, or micrometeorology, is divided into 3 subgroups. We have 4 sky variables, 3 radio weather report variables, and 3 temporal or time variables. Now, as I mentioned, the radio report, that's kind of like the weather report, because mostly what we get from the weather report is whether or not it's raining. We sometimes get a little bit about clouds, but not much about wind, really. We will be marrying the sight variables with the weather variables when we do the bottom half of the chart. The first thing we normally consider about the weather is whether or not it's clear. We've allotted 2 lines for clouds, from clear, 0% cloud cover, to overcast, 100% cloud cover. And then the second for the type of cloud. What would be the most reliable amount of cloud cover? Do you see it on your chart? What does it say? Clear. What else? Overcast. We're looking here on the right. You see that? High reliability. Get it straight here. Clear means no clouds. Overcast means 100% totally cloudy. Well, how can they both be reliable? If clear is reliable, wouldn't overcast be unreliable? Well, no. Think about it. If it's totally overcast, especially if it's a light, even white overcast, you're getting less heat through. Are we expecting imminent change? No. It's maybe an edge of a low. See what it lines up with. Stratus clouds. Now, what are stratus clouds like? They're layers. On the other side, low reliability side, you've got black clouds, storm clouds. 50% is the least reliable amount of cloud cover. You've got some places getting heat, and you've got some places not. So that's going to create kind of a mix. That's what an experienced pilot would be looking for.
It was during the Women's World Meeting in Greece, And we had a fantastic day of flying, got to 10,000 feet, beautiful thermals. I had never had such good conditions in Greece. And all of a sudden we're going on this little cross country. It was a triangle, and on the way back I noticed things starting to get bumpy. I noticed a fairly large cumulus in the back on the mountain, and I thought, well, it's a big cumulus, but it wasn't that threatening. Stayed a little longer in the air, and then I had this sense that things were really changing. And I thought, well, it's time to get back and land. And sure enough, I was maybe 1,000 feet off the deck, and a gust front hit. And I expected it was 30 to 45 out there. So it obviously was a very intense landing. In fact, it was the worst conditions I've ever landed in. And so I was very happy to be on the ground, and it got worse. You really have to keep your eyes open. You really have to take every little clue, the fact that the air was getting bumpier, that it hadn't been, notice all the changes. Basically, that dark cloud developed from a big cumulus to a cumulus in about 10 minutes.
Cirrus clouds go with high pressure, actually the edge of a high, so higher winds and fair weather. Cirrus clouds are those wispy, cotton candy mare's tail ones. They're up high, 30, 40,000 feet sometimes. Days that have large, puffy, well-defined cumulus clouds, not overdeveloped, not huge monsters, not black on the bottom, just nice big white clouds, that's a good thing for soaring, but bumpy for beginners. So for high reliability, you wouldn't want to go and fly in that yet. We'll talk about that more in a minute. The worst, the nastiest, or using another sailing analogy, the iceberg of the sky, is the cumulonimbus cloud, which is a hugely overdeveloped cumulus cloud that's gotten all black and gnarly and starts spitting thunder and lightning. Nothing with wings wants to be around a cumulonimbus cloud. So that would be a good example of a zero. This brings out another point. Any zero zeroes the whole chart. It doesn't matter what kind of wind it is. If you've got thunder or lightning in the sky, you don't want to be flying. Another obvious zero, if you want to look ahead to wind speed, on line 11, if it's blowing 50 miles an hour, it doesn't matter what the cloud cover is. You're not flying. That's a zero. Gust fronts can be 20 miles in advance of cumulonimbus clouds.
Most of the meet directors nowadays won't start a launch cycle in a competition if there's any possibility of thunder showers or thunderstorms on the horizon. And this is something that we've learned over the years. It's something that is rather obvious to some people, but in competition, when we're really being pressed to put in a day of competition, in the older days we used to fly when it was questionable.
Most of the other variables here are not going to zero the chart. Now, some people fly with cumulonimbus clouds in the sky. They figure they're going to ride that gust front out in front of the storm, going to get going 150 miles an hour and set a world record. I read a story from Italy about a group of 5 guys who got sucked up into a cumulonimbus cloud trying to do that. Only 2 of them survived. The others died of exposure. They became storm fodder. I mean, inside a cumulonimbus cloud, you could have 200-mile-an-hour winds going opposite directions. They could go 40, 50,000 feet high, and they can come on suddenly. These conditions are even less reliable for paragliders.
It was sunny out in front of us, and the wind was blowing just beautiful, 15 miles an hour, perfect ridge soaring, and there were a lot of pilots out flying. There were probably 10 or 15 people in the air just having a blast. And if you looked off to your west, which a lot of times we don't look sideways, we only want to look ahead or straight up, but way off to the side there's a big cumulus forming. And it was getting darker and darker, but this thing was 10, 15 miles away. And a lot of my students came up to me and said, "Steve, what do you think? Looks good. Should we go fly?" As they're accustomed to doing when they're new pilots. And I said, well, I know it looks good out there, and I know there's people flying and having fun, but look at that cloud off out to the side. And they would be like, "Oh, I want to fly." I said, well, it's one of those situations where it's 1 in 100 that something's going to go wrong, but why take that risk? That cloud is dark, and it's getting darker. Well, within 10 to 15 minutes, it got stronger and stronger. The sky got darker and darker, and a few smart pilots did come down and land. But before a lot of people were able to get out of the air, a gust front rolled through, just like I had thought it could have happened. And it started blowing 40 miles an hour at the lip. And there were about 6 paraglider pilots in the air at that time, and they just got worked. Luckily, no one was hurt. The point has a very smooth top, so if you do get blown over, there is no rotor. And luckily, the outcome was okay, but that was one of those things where just because 90% of the conditions looked good, there was one little part that was off the scale.
So yeah, do not mess with Mother Nature. She will humble you. Fronts are sort of the edge between highs and lows. Not exactly, because the front will often come in kind of like this. As that leading edge comes in and cold air hits the warm air, it's pushing it up and out of the way. And then once that cloud along that front passes, then it'll be clear and beautiful. So again, cold fronts are more dramatic, but no front is reliable. Why? Well, what's a front mean? It means change. We don't want change. We want reliable. We want predictable. A front's a zero.
I have scaled back my flying around big clouds. I've had a couple experiences lately of being caught in gust fronts, and I realized it doesn't take a big thunderstorm to give you a gust front. It's a little tiny band of rain can give you a gust front and send you for a ride.
The charts say post-frontal is more reliable than prefrontal. Well, now why would that be? I mean, if it's change, it's unreliable. Any ideas? Well, post is more reliable because the edge of the new system has already passed. So you know what you got. So where do you want to be? Out there with something unknown coming in at you and it hits you when you're in the air or about to take off? Or do you want to be here after it's gone by? Now you're in the new system. It may be reliably unreliable, but then at least we'll know. The winds may be too strong post-frontal, because it's often strong winds. Prefrontal is often soarable, so experienced pilots, okay. We're not going out for that stuff as beginners. Lapse rate may be a new term to you, but you are likely familiar with its concept. It's simply the change in temperature as you go up. And it's an important indicator of soarability. The standard lapse rate is on the bottom of your chart. It's 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 feet. You may be interested to know that there's sort of a line in the sky at 40, 50,000 feet called the tropopause. It's the altitude where cooling stops, where the lapse rate ceases at about minus 40, minus 50 Celsius. So air that starts hotter has to cool quicker, and hence the higher lapse rate. But what really makes the air active is the differentials. When would we get the biggest differential lapse rates? Spring and fall. We get really cold nights, but then the sun really cooks the surface during the day. So the temperature on the ground builds up really quickly, and you'll get that high lapse rate in the ambient air. This also occurs in the desert. It's really magical that the lapse rate inside the thermal stays at 2 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet, and the lapse rate outside the thermal is higher. Now you'll notice that lapse rate is right beside moisture, and that's because temperature and moisture both play a role here. Let's say we've got this lake and a plowed field and the trees and the winds coming from behind here. Now the sun comes up. What's going to happen? Well, the field's going to get heated up first. It heats the air adjacent, which is going to start to expand and rise. And that'll bring the cool air in from the lake. And what about the trees? If the trees turn brown or yellow, like during the fall, they can be a pretty good heat source. When it's green and still has the chlorophyll in it, the chlorophyll eats up the heat. That's what chlorophyll does. It actually absorbs part of the heat and turns it into plant energy. What's going to happen here is eventually this. It's going to pinch in at the bottom, and this puppy is going to go whoosh. And around this plowed field where all this air is going to go to fill in the hole that was vacated by the hunk of warm air that headed off into the upper air. The air inside there, this is of course a simplistic example, we call that center the core, because you see that the air is going up faster than this air on the outside. But understand, this whole thing is going up. Out here, we've got this sinking air to fill these holes that are left by this air, which left here to go there. So what have we got in between? We've got air going up on one side, we've got air going down on the other. What's that? The very line above this is fronts, but also shear. A shear is just like a front. You'll sometimes have horizontal shear in a front. This is vertical shear. So when you're flying thermally air, you've got to fly through shear, except maybe near the ground. Thermals take off fairly gently, unless the temperature differentials are really extreme, like midday in the desert. Have you ever seen a hot air balloon take off? Doesn't exactly flatten your hair, takes off slowly. As the thermal goes up faster and faster and the air is going down faster and faster beside it, the shear can get more and more dramatic.
And as I climbed in this one thermal and got closer and closer to cloud base, next thing I knew, the glider went nuts. The glider became uncontrollable. I lost probably 2,500 vertical feet, better part of a minute, at least a minute of being out of control. And finally, it all came back and I was able to fly away and land. But it taught me a big lesson about how forceful thermals can be when they hit their ceiling. When you hit cloud base, it can be pretty active air.
Let's just think about how this would be if we're flying. Now we're flying along. Oh, we hit a little bit of sink, and then boom, our nose goes up because we hit the thermal. Cool, we're going up. This is good. What would you probably do though? We've pitched up a bit here. Our keel is still in the sink. We'd keep on going, take a little bit of speed. Now, if you're in the thermal and you want to stay up in the thermal, we should slow down to minimum sink. We'll see that in the wing lecture. But we're beginners. We're not thermaling yet. Besides, maybe we're too low anyway. So we would just keep going straight. We took a little bit of speed, so now we go back to trim. Ha! Life is good. Now we're getting to the other side of the thermal, and we hit the sink. Uh-oh! Now my keel is in lift and my nose is in sink. The glider pitches down. Now what are you going to do? Push out and get the nose back up. Wrong. Oh no. You're going to fight that tendency to push out because the glider is going to stall, and that would be a bad thing. So what you're going to do is help the glider recover. You don't have to pull the bar to your waist, but you're going to take some speed and help fly through the shear and just get into the air on the other side with a little bit of airspeed and thus control. It's kind of counterintuitive. It feels like you should push out, and the more dramatic the shear, the more important you don't push out. Take speed and get through and out of there. This is a simple textbook type thermal. Few thermals are like this in real life. Lots of times there's actually strong lift on the outside of the thermal as well. And many thermals have multiple cores. I call them hotspots. You could enter a thermal in Florida with 50 other gliders above you. If you could get right in one of those hotspots, and it might not be in the center, might be out in the side, and if you bank steeply to stay in the strong lift, you can climb right through the whole gaggle and end up on top of all 50 of them. Outside the thermal, the lapse rate might be 4 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet. What's going to happen to the air every 1,000 feet in the thermal relative to the air outside the thermal? Think about it. You've got the temperature in the thermal, we got the temperature outside, and then we got the difference. So here's a table. If we start with ground zero, 1,000 feet, and then 5,000 feet. Let's say it was 24 Celsius, like 75 Fahrenheit in the thermal, and 20 or 68 Fahrenheit outside. So the thermal's 4 degrees warmer. It has to be warmer or it wouldn't go up. So our difference is 4. Big deal. Not much differential. Enough that maybe it might lift off like a balloon. It gets up 1,000 feet. How much does the air cool in the thermal? 2 degrees. Or 3.5 Fahrenheit. So inside, it's down to 22. And outside the thermal, it's cooled 4 degrees. So it's down to 16. Oh my gosh. We've gone up 1,000 feet, and now the differential is 6 degrees. Kind of interesting. Now we go up 5,000 feet. How much does the air in the thermal cool? Well, 5 times 2 is 10. Subtracted from 24, 14. What about outside? 5 times 4 is 20. We've got a 14 degrees Celsius or 25 Fahrenheit differential at 5,000 feet. What do you think is going to be happening to that thermal as it goes up? It gets bigger and hotter and moving faster. It's lighter and lighter. It's like someone in that hot air balloon is holding the burner on, so it climbs faster and faster. It's the same idea. And this is quite typical. You read about it all the time. A person flying cross country gets down to 500 feet, thinks it's all over, and then he makes a low save. Finds a little bit of a thermal and he works it, and he's just barely maintaining.
I took off, and I took off what I'm afraid was a little early, and I ended up being 300 foot off the deck thinking, oh well, I'm going to have to break down and set up again. And but very low, I encountered this little lift, and I started working it and found myself at 10,000 feet, and it doesn't get any better than that.
Now, does this go on forever? What happens at the top? What happens to water vapor at a certain point called the dew point? It turns to liquid. The vapor turns into actual water droplets. If there are condensation nuclei, this is what forms a cloud. What kind of cloud? Cumulus. That cumulus cloud is a picture of the thermal that formed it. An important thing for you to realize is, when should you leave the thermal? You don't want to go up where it's 1,000 feet a minute lift and the clouds are right above you and you're about to get eaten.
You know, in close to 30 years of flying hang gliders, there's one thing that scares me, and that's bad weather flying or flying near large clouds. So I've got a rule for how to do that safely, and I think every pilot should have a similar rule. Get out on your practice days and learn your highest capable maximum descent rate. How steeply can you dive that glider, and measure it in feet per minute. Then cut that number in half, and if ever you're around clouds and your climb rate reaches that number, 50% of your maximum dive rate, it's time to pull in, lower that nose, stop climbing, and get to the edge of that cloud.
Another point, the stronger the lift, the higher the bank angle, is a really good rule of thumb. The reason is twofold. If you turn steeply, you'll stay in the better part of the lift. Secondly, if you get spit out turning, you can't get rolled upside down. And if you do, you'll roll right out of it. If you go out straight, you have a chance of being tumbled, and paragliders can collapse. This is also one time you would not have a light touch. You would be hanging on with a death grip. So other than this vertical shear and frontal horizontal shear, there is also topographically generated mechanical turbulence, which we'll cover later, and wake turbulence from other aircraft. Regardless of the source, just take a little bit of speed. Speed is your friend. Speed is control. If you're close, like 50 feet from the ground, if you hit up air, it's only a matter of time before you hit down air. So why not be ready for it? Keep a little bit of speed. But if your nose drops, you want to keep your speed until you're just about on the ground, and then you can let it off. If you ever do get caught in cloud suck, you pull the bar in and you're still going up. You're in 1,300 foot a minute lift and your max sink is 1,000 feet a minute. You're still going up 200 feet a minute and you do not want to go into that cloud. What you should do is head 90 degrees to the direction of the wind. Go crosswind. Now, how do you know where the wind is coming from? Well, trees, water, smoke, and drift is a big one. If you're doing circles and you're looking down, you're going to be drifting one way or another. If you're in a thermal and you've gone from 300 feet a minute lift to 1,000 feet a minute lift, you've been in it for a while, and you should be able to tell which way you're going by looking at the ground. So as you're turning and the wind is blowing, you're drifting downwind. So head perpendicular. That's your best chance. Haul the bar in and hope. Now, if you can't escape, don't panic. You won't die unless maybe it's a cumulonimbus. I've sometimes been asked about different kinds of thermals. You may have heard of bubble thermals or column thermals. Do thermals go up in bursts? What about continuous thermals? What do they depend on? Which go up quicker? Which are more common? How big are they? Well, there's a huge variety, varying in size from tiny bullets that aren't big enough to turn in to huge monsters with multiple cores that seem never to end. Like people, they have a wide variety of personalities, and like us, they depend on what formed them and the environment they grew up in. All these variables, lapse rate, temperature, moisture, etc. Temperature and moisture are the bookends for barometric pressure. They are what cause the air to be lighter or thinner, or heavier and denser. Which is more stable? Which is heavier? Moist air or dry air? Most would think moist air is heavier, right? Wrong. Water is heavier than air, of course, but think of the chemical makeup of water vapor, H2O. Hydrogen is the lightest element. Thus, water vapor is lighter than air, which is mostly nitrogen, kind of N2O2. Dry air, cold air are more reliable than the reverse. And it's not going to be a zero if we have a lot of moisture. I mean, we can even fly in the rain. It's just less reliable. Moisture, heat, and high lapse rate together might lead to thunderstorms, as we mentioned. That'd be a zero. One thing about rain, and please note this on your chart, if your glider has mylar leading edges, you should soap them. If you don't, water droplets will form on your leading edge, like big beads on a waxed car. This disrupts the airflow. If you soap your leading edges, it will dissipate the surface tension and the water will just run off. If you have a Dacron-covered leading edge, no problem. If you forget and get caught, just pull in and fly fast. This will correct the aft CG and blow some of the water off. Another problem with flying in the rain is that you want to have eye protection because the rain could blind you. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go fly in the rain, but a little bit of rain is no big deal for a hang glider. Even a lot of water isn't a big deal. On the other hand, for a paraglider, it can be a big deal. Water can get trapped in the trailing edge, becoming heavier and heavier, and then the wing could stall. Bad thing. We have a situation, something like fronts with barometric pressure. That is, we have a changing component to consider. Now, the center of the high and steady, is going to be the best, the most reliable. It probably won't be very soarable, too stable, but it will be reliable. Then you got high and rising, and then you have low and steady, and all those other combinations. You can appreciate the center of the low is going to be the worst. It says on the chart that a rising barometer is always more reliable than a falling one. Oh, wait a minute. Why would that be? They're both changing. The essence of reliability is the absence of change. But think about it. If you're in a high and the barometer is rising, you're heading toward the center. That's better. If you're in a low, you're heading toward the edge. And that's better. And conversely, falling, you're heading toward the edge of the high, which is higher winds, or the center of the low, which is worse. So we see a rising barometer is always better, whether you're in a high or a low. And conversely, a falling barometer is always less reliable. As with moisture, so with temperature. It could be hot and you can still fly. The air is thinner, that's all. If you add in high altitude and the density of the air is already less, and you have moisture and high temperature, it could turn into a difficult launch, or even a dangerous one. You really have to run, so watch out for that. Temporal variables are pretty obvious, but still, they are considerations. There are no zeros. There's no season or time we can't fly. Well, with the exception of flying at night, that's a no-no. The law forbids us to fly 30 minutes after sunset and no sooner than 30 minutes before sunrise. And it's not only just the law, it would be pretty hard to see anything on the ground at those times, especially in your landing zone. Can you see why midday is the least reliable? More temperature differential, so generally speaking, more convection, more air moving both vertically and horizontally. Experienced pilots will sometimes start their day around 11 a.m., thriving to search for thermals that will keep them up for the whole day. For beginners, the turbulence could be quite unsettling and quite uncomfortable until they can develop their flying skills and a taste for thermals. We prefer flying our students in the morning or after 4 in the afternoon. The air is usually a lot more stable, a lot more reliable.
I just got done with a flight behind the Dragonfly Tug here at Wallaby Ranch this evening. It was calm and smooth. I'm flying a Spectrum, which is a glider that I've flown for several years. I'm very comfortable with it. And I had a nice smooth tow in smooth air. It was beautiful, towing up into the sunset. I flew around for a while, just not seeing anything but smooth, pleasant air, no violent updrafts or downdrafts. There was some traffic that I had to keep aware of, but no one at my altitude, and since there was no lift or sink of any note out there, pretty much I knew I was going to be on the ground by myself since there wasn't anyone else at the same altitude. So I had time to look around, enjoy the scenery, and set up a good approach and fly in and make a nice smooth landing on my feet.
Flying before sunset can be a very uplifting experience. Not only is the view spectacular, but the air is so smooth you rarely get a bump. Sometimes over a valley you can soar on the warm air for ages. That's a wonder wind. For the same reason midday is not as reliable as any other time of the day, spring and fall are the least reliable of all the seasons. The differentials are greater. On the other hand, for experienced pilots, those seasons offer the best soaring because of that instability. More moisture in spring, certainly, so that's least reliable. Summer is a beautiful time, lovely and warm, but sometimes a little bit unstable. And it's plain to see, winter is the most reliable. It's the driest and the coolest air. There are fewer good days to fly in the winter though. When it's a good day, it's fantastic. Flying in the snow is pretty cool. I'm often so bundled up that I'm warmer in winter than I am in the summer. You don't get much of a lapse rate and the differential isn't as great, but you get rock steady air. If you're flying ridges, you can soar with much less wind, like 5-10 miles an hour in a good spot.
Something that's unique at this flying site is the incredible number of really good, you might call it undisturbed weather-wise flying days. We can get 150 days in a row, and the only decision, it's not whether to launch or not, it's whether you want 1 hour or 4 hours airtime. But that's only for the summer. In the winter, we get some obvious decisions you can't fly, and back to some obvious that you can, but there's some really surprise days that will get you.
Now what the heck has wind direction to do with time? Wind and time, they're not even in the same dimension. Think about it. Wind direction, highs and lows from the beginning. We said if the wind is blowing strong from the northwest, you probably have a high coming in. If it's strong from the southwest, probably leaving. Light west wind, probably in the center of the high. So it's the timing of the system. That's what wind direction gives you. In each area of the globe, patterns such as this occur. Whether you fly from a hill or on tow, the bottom half of the chart, the site selection part, is also divided into 3 subsections. 3 wind variables, 4 site variables, and finally 3 surroundings or environs variables.
We can sit down and do a site analysis at the beginning of the day, and then 2 hours later when the student's ready to launch, the conditions have completely changed. So if you don't somehow help them establish sort of a criterion that they always follow and create the thought process not only while their feet are on the ground but also when they're in the air, so that they're aware of, yeah, the wind's shifting by 5 degrees, or hey, it's picked up 2 or 3 miles an hour. This will really do a lot to teach the proactive safety that we're trying to get across.
Most accidents are on takeoff and landing. So high winds, especially gusty winds, interfere with our ability to control the glider at those critical times. The stronger the wind, the stronger the turbulence that it develops. Even in strong winds, close to the ground, the wind is less. This diminishing of the wind as we come close to the ground is called wind gradient. If we are hidden behind some obstacle, like a building or trees, from the direct force of the wind, this area is called a wind shadow. Close to the obstacle, we have a very severe rotor. We'll go into these phenomena in more detail in the wing lecture when we have the wing to marry with the wind and place them in these situations. Be aware, though, that in really strong winds, if you get on the back side of a mountain, there are huge rotors. We talked about mechanical turbulence, which is turbulence behind things. So if you have an obstacle to the wind, you can expect turbulence behind it. The bigger the obstacle, the bigger the turbulence. The stronger the wind, the bigger the turbulence. An expert can certainly fly in more than the 25 miles an hour listed on the charts, just like a novice could fly in the more than 15. Gliders will go a lot faster than that. The reason we choose a conservative upper limit is that when you're flying, the wind could increase. If you're flying at your limit, you have no room. If the wind picks up, you're going backwards. If you're flying a mountain, you could be blown over the backside into that nasty rotor. Bad news, especially for a paraglider.
I guess my most recent scary flight situation was on my paraglider at Yaquina Head. I had I'd gotten there in the afternoon, it was blowing hard. And I waited until around 8 p.m. when I thought it had probably backed down enough. My first mistake. I didn't wait for conservatively safe conditions. I thought, it's probably okay. It's backed off some, yeah, sure. And I've moved down the slope a ways. Okay, so I thought I'll just kite the wing over my head and just see how it feels before I commit to flight. Second stupid thing was to pull the wing up, not knowing for sure what was going to happen. What happened was that I got yanked straight off my feet, 50 feet up, going backwards at a hell of a clip, and so I jammed on the speed bar right away, and I managed to at least stop moving backwards. Now, Yaquina Head's got a quarry on the back side of the hill. It's about 150 feet of flat across the top, and then it drops straight down 200 feet into a quarry, and it's all ocean and seals on the other side. So if you get back in that rotor, you die. It's not a forgiving place, and that was another stupid thing, was not to consider what could happen. I jammed on the speed bar, I managed to stop moving forward, then I started going up, then I started going backwards again. Then I grabbed full big ears and speed bar, which is a situation I've never been in before, and I didn't really know how my DHV-1 5-year-old trainer slow wing was going to fly that way. Fortunately, it just sank like a rock, which is what I wanted it to do at that stage. And after waiting what seemed like forever for the wing to finally start coming down, I managed to squeak my way out far enough in front of the hill to plop down in the backyard of the people who lived immediately below launch. I don't think they like people landing there. It's a manicured, flat backyard. Looks like it's pruned with tweezers. But I got down, they didn't see me, and I wadded up my wing and ran away. My wife was watching all of this, and I asked her what she thought afterwards. She said, "You don't usually stand on that bar thingy and pull on the ropes at the same time, do you?" And she said, "I thought about calling for help, but I decided to just wait and see where you hit to see whether I should call an ambulance or just bring a spoon."
We don't think about wind speed without thinking about gust factor. Gust factor, the difference between the upper and lower limits of the wind, is more important than wind strength in many ways. It's the change that can mess up a launch or a landing. If you have a steady 20-mile-an-hour wind, it's more reliable than a wind that is gusting from 5 to 15. With a 10-mile-an-hour gust factor, why is that change so dramatic to deal with? It's because the relationship between speed and force is an exponential one. check out this formula. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. Now that means that the force exerted by a 5-mile-an-hour wind is going to be half the mass of that wind times 5 squared. So it would be 25 m/2. Now if we look at a 10-mile-an-hour wind, well, it's only twice as strong, right? Wrong. Because 1/2 m times 10 squared is 100 m/2. Well, the two m's cross each other out, and a 10-mile-an-hour wind is 4 times as strong as a 5-mile-an-hour wind. That's why it's so important to be aware of gusts. If you look at the chart, you'll see that the allowable gust factor is about half the allowable wind speed. As a beginner or novice pilot, 15-mile-an-hour wind is the max you can fly in. If you're scoring that out of 10, you might get a 1 or a 2. But if it were 16 mile an hour, you'd score a 0. Now what's the allowable gust factor? 7. That would be another 1 out of 10 if you had a 7-mile-an-hour gust factor. You'd need a lot of 10s in the rest of the chart to be able to average the 75% you need. For an experienced pilot, we're saying 25 miles an hour is your maximum with a 12-mile-an-hour gust factor. For an expert pilot, that's his or her own choice. The other considerations are the speed, duration, and direction of the gust. Many paraglider pilots like to time the spacing of gusts and the duration. Gusts that are sudden, random, or from a different direction are far less reliable than gusts that gradually build from the same direction and gradually diminish. Crosswinds are not as much of a problem towing as they are in hill launching. This again shows why we have two different charts. This is the first line that makes much of a difference. It's important to be aware of both launch types, even if you're only involved in one right now. For a hill launch, we see the maximum crosswind of 45 degrees, or for beginners, 30 degrees.
Personally, once I see crosswind takeoffs of 30 degrees, that's beyond my capability. I just won't do them.
One of the most dangerous things you can do is to get blown off and back downwind after launching into a mountain. That's a recipe for disaster.
You know, my first day of flying, and again, this is with no instruction, sandals, no helmet, nobody could give me any advice at all. I thought I found a thermal. It's my third flight, so I've got it down now, right? And so I found this thermal, and I'm rising. I can see that in an elevation or horizon check, and so I decided to turn. Well, there was some wind, and so as I turned, I actually drifted downwind and flew right into the hillside. Big puff of dust. I went ass over tea kettle. There's my glider all through the bushes. You know, and I've gone back and looked at that site, and I actually hit the ground probably 15 feet from a massive rock. And it could have really gone a lot differently. It could have been a bad deal. You know, I've since learned that making 360 turns causes you to drift downwind, so you have to have plenty of clearance to the hillside.
But on a tow launch, two things are happening. Firstly, if you blow the launch, you'll have a safe escape. And to do this, you have to analyze the site and plan your launch accordingly. The stronger the wind, the more mechanical turbulence. So upwind obstacles are a problem. Crosswinds might throw turbulence across your path. Think again about the difference between a 15-mile-an-hour wind and a 25-mile-an-hour wind. 15 squared is 225. 25 squared is 625. Huge difference. Be conservative. Secondly, the tow force generated by being pulled develops a wind straight in, so that by the time you reach launch speed, the crosswind is diminished. So, if you're launching in a 5-mile-an-hour, 90-degree crosswind, you have a 15-mile-an-hour headwind generated by the tow. By the time you launch, your crosswind is only 30 degrees. And of course, the winch or tug can pull you even faster. A dolly launch allows you extra speed. We can even take off downwind towing. But don't ever think about taking off downwind off a hill. It can be done, but don't do it. There's no room for change. It's not worth the chance. On the other hand, zero wind on a shallow slope is also very demanding, especially at altitude. You'll have to run like crazy. Depending on what is below you, if you don't launch safely, what are the consequences? If it's a big grassy hill, no big deal. If there are jagged rocks, then maybe wait till you have some wind in your face.
I've had a meet where I was on a launch ramp that was marginally long enough to do a no-wind takeoff. The launch director gave me 30 seconds to fly, and I told him that it wasn't launchable. And he started counting down the 30 seconds. And I had no choice. If I wanted to be competitive, I had to go in no wind, even though I knew it was very risky. In this particular case, I did go and I got away with it, but I don't know that I would try it today.
Launching in a lull is another bad idea. Some people think that on a day with a strong wind, they can wait until it drops. That's a bad idea. What if the next gust comes just as you're starting your run? You're far better to launch at the start of a cycle, because then you know what you've got. And if you can't handle it, don't launch. But to launch in a lull and then get hit, no fun. As your instructor has probably pointed out, to foot launch in a crosswind, point the nose into the wind so the glider is balanced and then run straight. On a dolly, stay a little on the upwind side of the glider when it's on the cart. The larger the hill, the lower the reliability. A small 50-foot training hill, high reliability. A 5,000, 10,000 foot mountain, low reliability. Similarly, as we go from a smooth, sculpted, featureless training hill to a jagged, outcropped, gapped mountain, the reliability drops. A perfect hill would look something like this. Smooth, round shape, with the wind coming straight up. The smooth shape allows the air to follow the curves and pass over the hill without creating turbulence. As the shape gets more irregular, the air is turbulated and becomes more dangerous. Play it safe. So the perfect tow site would be a 100-acre manicured lawn, cut short without an obstacle. Plenty of room for the tug or the tow to be aborted and landed safely. If you're towing out of an obstacle-infested flight park, the chances of having a problem are much increased. Obstacles upwind or downwind can be a problem if a tow needs to be aborted. Crosswinds aren't so much of a problem for a tow if you have the length and width. If you're coming out of a narrow tow site or a hill site like a slot in the trees, then the crosswind is something that you have to think about. Because if the wind is coming over obstacles, it's turbulated. And if you get blown off, what are you going to hit? That's the aspect of narrowness being a problem. As we progress from a very gentle slope to a very steep slope, the reliability decreases. This slope, just outside Salt Lake City at Point of the Mountain, is 10 out of 10 in reliability. It's perfect. Even the shape and size are ideal. It's perfectly rounded on top and bottom with a relatively steep face. This gives good lift, but moves the rotors way back.
And one of the elements that really caught my attention on the chart was the type of slope to launch from. Some pilot will state, oh, cliff, steep is better. Some pilot will say flat is better. But on the chart you can see that the medium slope is really the most reliable.
As we look at a place like Torrey Pines, it's a reliable almost cliff launch, but there is going to be a rotor to watch out for when top landing.
If we tell a student not to fly behind the ridge because of rotor, we can actually walk along the area and we can have them go through and feel it. And then later on we can have them kiting in it, and we can have them ground handling in areas where there's specifically rotor here, or here there's no rotor specifically, and then they can feel the difference. And when they see their wing, tossing and turning and trying to collapse on them, they'll very easily get the idea that, hey, maybe I don't want to fly through this if I can't control it on the ground. It's also real easy to do, again, as the wind increases or shifts in direction. Again, we can walk around the field. They can feel when the wind's blowing at their face or when it's blowing at their back, and they'll be able to give themselves sort of I guess you could say they can draw their own picture of what the air is doing. Finally, we get, in the summertime, coastal low that sets up, and it makes it real nice because we'll get a cloud layer that develops early in the morning. Then you can actually sit down and you can watch the fog as it's rolling through, and you can see where the areas of turbulence are. So that's kind of a picture that would be difficult to draw in other places that we can actually see here. So once a student sees this, you'll find that they'll really, really limit the conditions that they're flying in. And this knowledge, of course, stays with them throughout their flying career.
A cliff is reserved strictly for experts. You need a crew not only to help you through the rotor, but also to help you launch. Undercuts in anything over 5-mile-an-hour wind is a zero in reliability even for experts, because a rotor can develop in front of launch. As we mentioned, the optimum surface for a tow site would be short grass, totally level, no obstructions. Why is surface a potential problem? Well, for takeoff and landing. It's also very important to look at your landing zone before launch, especially at a hill launch. If you don't have a good place to land and know all its secrets, forget it. When looking at a runway surface, remember wheels are useless if the grass is more than 10 inches long. Even at 6 inches, where it starts to hit your base bar, it gets a little hairy. And at 12 inches, it's like Velcro. And if that Velcro or anything ever grabs you and your glider stops suddenly, immediately let go and curl. You don't want to be hanging on. You could break your arm or shoulder. Women have to be especially careful of that because their arms are less dense. It will break a guy's arm too. It will take more force for a light person to break a down tube than a heavy person. So just let go. Let the glider take the shock. That's what it's there for. Wheels don't work well in sand or mud either. The reason we check the landing area before we take off is that landing is a necessity. Taking off is optional. It's extremely difficult to analyze a landing area from the air. The LZ should be walked, carefully examining, looking for rocks, holes, anything that could trip you up. Look for wires and fences that are very difficult to see from the air. It's a good idea to set up a windsock or streamers because the wind is often different in the landing area than it is on takeoff. I can even recall situations where pilots took off, flew to where they thought the landing area was going to be, you can't miss it, and weren't able to find it. They landed in the wrong field. A shotgun full of rock salt would be a good way to reinforce this lesson. Scoring the landing area is quite similar whether you're launching from a hill or from a tow. The difference is that generally tow sites are flat. Hill site landing areas are often sloping. Be very careful when approaching this kind of landing area. In light winds, it's preferable to land uphill, even if it's a little downwind. Crosswind landings are often a good idea. Landing downwind on a slope can be really tricky. You'll sometimes feel like the Energizer Bunny. You keep going and going. Maybe there's a barbed wire fence at the end of the field and you can't get stopped. Leave yourself lots of room.
I remember an incident where some out-of-town pilots came and wanted to fly our site, and without stopping to check the LZ, they figured they were okay because they were advanced pilots. It wasn't going to be a problem. They went up to launch, had a great flight, and as they flew out, they looked at the wind direction and decided they were going to land directly into the wind. And they came in and landed, and it turned out that that was downhill, and they ended up crashing into some oleander trees at the very end.
Another common problem in landings is trying to land too close to the breakdown area or your vehicle. Some people say, great pilots never force themselves to demonstrate their great ability. Landing in a tight area is a recipe for an accident. Eventually, you'll overshoot and whack. Better to always leave yourself lots of room so that if your glide gets extended, it's not a problem. The reason cross-country flying is for experts only is because they haven't been able to examine the landing area before they launch. They have to do a site analysis from the air. It's almost impossible to do so reliably. So assessing the reliability of the takeoff area is much like doing a mini site analysis. We need to examine not only the shape and wind direction, but the size of the gap, where the obstacles are, is the wind crossing. The additional thing, we need to check the footing. Are there holes, rocks, long grass? All are hindrances and lower our reliability.
The place where we launch from is actually a foothill in front of a larger mountain range that's set 1.5 miles back and about 1,500 feet higher. And sometimes the wind's blowing over the back of the higher ridge, yet we're on the upslope, barely. And the wind is converging right near launch. And sometimes it takes a trained eye to understand that we're really not really wise to launch. And so that's why I say students need to take it slow, stick around either their instructor or the pilots that know a particular flying site. There's sometimes some valuable information just before you decide to launch.
Another thing to consider before we take off is flight planning, where we want to be and where we don't want to be. Remind yourself to turn into the wind and onto final approach in clean air with plenty of altitude if possible. Low turns are fraught with disaster.
And you can analyze a site and basically break it down into a step-by-step process where they'll analyze things like weather conditions on a micro and a macro scale, the physical topography in the terrain, alternative landing zones, bailout points at launch, all of these different things. We can give them a process that'll allow them to build kind of a basic foundation that they can use to develop a flight plan regardless of site or conditions or whether they've flown it before or this is their first time. This is one of the things we really try to instill in them from pretty much their first flight on.
Planning ahead, being an impeccable warrior, a Boy Scout, helps avoid panic and pain. Blowing a launch with a forgiving hill covering, like sand, is not a problem. An aborted launch on a hill covered with jagged rocks could kill you. Also, consider the environs, the surroundings. It's important because you can land safely even if you're not able to make it back to the intended landing field. Are you surrounded by grassy open fields or cacti? Sometimes our site has corn on two sides. The score here will change according to the season. Now you can land in tall corn. It's not going to kill you, but it might break the glider and hurt you. When you're landing in something like that, like sugar cane or even tall grass, think of the top of the corn as the ground. Obviously you can't run out the landing. As the glider begins to stall, you need to flare hard up and out. Then hold it there and let yourself drop down into whatever it is. Make sure you're relaxed to take the shock. And how about a beach site? Knowledgeable pilots would rather land downwind into a barbed wire fence than land in the surf. It's imperative to land or even crash crosswind on the beach rather than risk drowning. Landing in water should be avoided at all costs.
If you land in water, the forces of that water on your glider will just crush it down and really take a major toll on your equipment and yourself if you're not fast enough to get out of there. You've got to have hook knives and not only hook knives but a good diving knife to fly around water, because if you do go in water to pierce the sail and get out, I mean there's there's a lot of stuff going on there. The technique for landing that I've always found best at the beach is to do a crosswind landing approach, and then at the very last second, when you're just getting ready to flare, you just do a slight turn into the wind so you can flare straight into the wind. The most important thing is just never land in the water. Never land close to the water. If you land close to the water, before you do anything else, back up, get away from the water before you try to unhook and get out of your glider. There have been cases that I've seen, and I've performed surf rescue where, you know, somebody got the tips down and it just started dragging them right back out. You know, they thought they were up on dry land, the water came up, got behind the tips, started crushing it down, and as soon as the water starts on there, you know, you've got a serious situation developing very rapidly.
There are world record sites where if you go down in the first 50 miles, you're in a prickly place. Every single thing there either stings, sticks, or bites. And it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Oh yeah, it's scary. You need knee pads and body armor. Pilots there all fly with pliers to pull out the spikes. And you don't have to worry about bandages. The flies will clean up the blood. For me, this type of surrounding would be a zero.
Flying in Tucson can be very challenging. I've heard it's actually one of the more challenging places because of the desert conditions. We have very hostile terrain. Many of the launches are narrow and steep.
You need to make those decisions for yourself when you get to that level. Being surrounded by trees would score like maybe a 5, unless it was a burned out giant pine forest. So that's what we mean by adjacent alternatives. Other than the surf, in terms of wind origins, oceans are the best locations. There are no obstacles to the air. There are awesome ocean sites like Torrey Pines in California, and even Point of the Mountain near Salt Lake City, Utah, with its great exposure to clean air. Also in surroundings, we need to consider air traffic and even ground traffic density. A site near an airport or an airbase is less reliable. Busy roads can reduce the reliability. Being vigilant and doing lots of turns, thus making yourself more visible, can minimize the nightmare of a mid-air collision. Having the right of way is a moot point if you get hit by an aircraft. Sites with lots of hang gliders or paragliders are also less reliable. If we're in the middle of the mountains, we can't get good air, even by mail. So, if there's much wind blowing, it could be coming from everywhere and anywhere. Also, the wind in the valley will often be 90 degrees cross to the launch. Small hills are normally reliable, but if they're surrounded by mountains, they score low. Be careful about landings late in the day in the mountains, because the wind will often begin to flow downslope at sunset. Visibility is simply how far you can see. It's expressed in miles or kilometers. In addition to smog, fog, and low clouds, a bunch of stuff can affect your ability to see clearly, like rain, snow, dust, etc. At sunset, visibility and depth perception are reduced. Visibility at a tow site is less of a problem than at a mountain site. At a tow site, where you're taking off from the ground and lose visibility, you can come right down again, and there's the field. If you were to lose visibility on a mountain site, it's spooky. You could run into the mountain. You can't tell what direction you're going, so you may not find your landing area. There's also the danger of other hang gliders or paragliders flying blindly into you. You certainly can't go off a mountain without a 3-mile visibility. That's why there are a couple of asterisks on the chart beside 1-mile visibility. Another thing is, you could go blind from rain, as I mentioned earlier. It's a really good idea to wear eye protection. With towing, there's always the possibility of something coming back and hitting you. Also, consider the possibility of dust or bugs getting in your eyes. A blind pilot is not a reliable pilot. It amazes me that even though I have only one eye, I have no problem with depth perception. It took about 6 months to reprogram the computer in here. Even the ability to juggle came back, although it took a while. On a clear day when you can see forever, score yourself a 10.
one particular day cloud base was dropping. It wasn't a wind direction issue, it was visibility. And even though clouds were wisping by where we were setting up on top of the mountain, it was, I continued to go ahead and set up, and I moved the entourage with everybody right down to launch. Because if you haven't launched, you're not hang gliding. I remember hearing, I'm standing on launch with several people behind me, people saying, "This guy's crazy. What does he think?" As we're totally enshrouded in fog. The wind is perfect, but they didn't realize that I had not committed to launching yet. I can go through everything as if I was going to launch, because a 1 in 100 chance clouds could lift and I could launch. And we were far enough in the day that I was willing to take that 1 in 100 and continue on with the motions. Ultimately, we did break down. We walked back up to the setup area and we had to tear down. But you can go ahead with preparing to launch, but be careful. Don't make the decision to launch unless it's absolutely right.
To help retain all this, you need to practice doing your charts of reliability. Just score them. See what you come up with. You can do the top half before you leave home. Now, why would that be? Well, what if the weather is not flyable? Then why would you want to drive to the flying site on a non-flyable day? The problem is, if you drive there, now you're going to want to fly. Weather's not good, but hey, I'm here. I drove all the way here. I got to fly. No, you don't. Don't let yourself get trapped into these situations. Flying is a different kind of thing. If I say I'm going to play cards on Tuesday night, I can pretty well always do so. I can't do that with flying. It's weather permitting. Flying is a bit like poker. You got to know when to hold 'em and know when to fold 'em.
Especially if you haven't been flying much lately, it's so easy to get wrapped up in the idea of, I've got to fly today, this has been my only day off in weeks to go fly, and you're not looking at the conditions, you're not looking at yourself. Am I tired today? Am I dehydrated?
As much as I love to fly, and I've driven the distance to be there, and I want more than anything to fly, to look at conditions rationally and realistically instead of with a desire, it has saved my life. It's helped me to not launch so I can come back and fly again another day.
I'd like to close with the derivation of the title of this video, the wondrous part of the wind. It gets its name from a special hang gliding phenomenon. My first wonder wind is described in the RCR manual on page 24. A wonder wind, or glass off, is a magical occurrence that happens regularly at some sites about an hour before sunset in the right conditions. One theory to explain the glass off phenomenon is that as the air cools and sinks down, accumulating on the valley floor, the latent heat that has collected there breaks off all at once, and the entire valley of air rises. Whoa! I wish you all such an experience.